Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. On a cold, dark night in the North Atlantic, a great hospital ship journeyed towards Ireland. Passengers were either preparing for bed or already asleep. She was only 200 kilometers from her destination, but outside, a German U-boat was lurking, hunting for what the captain believed the ship was hiding: ammunition and troops. Rather than stopping to search the ship, the captain did what Han Solo was known for: shoot first and ask questions later. With a word, he ordered his crew to launch a torpedo. It hit the sleeping vessel and ripped a hole in her side. And as the cold water of the Atlantic rushed in, the ship was underwater within 10 minutes. She disappeared beneath the waves as passengers struggled to escape on lifeboats. Many survived, only for the U-boat to open fire on them. It was considered a war crime, and the incident had far-reaching consequences. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today we're traveling back to the First World War as I share the terrible tragedy of HHMS Llandovery Castle. The Union Castle Line was a British shipping line that operated passenger and cargo fleets between Europe and Africa from 1900 to 1977. It acquired the Royal Mail Line in 1912 and began work on two new ships which would be named in honour of the company's South Wales heritage. The first was the SS Llandovery Castle. Named after the castle built around 1100 CE by the Normans, it sits on a much older Iron Age promontory fort, meaning the area has been inhabited for several millennia. The castle was built during the invasion of Wales and still stands today. The second ship, SS Llandovery Castle, which is why we're here today, was named after a great castle built 900 years ago by the Normans. Only a few parts of it still survive as ruins because in 1532, the castle was destroyed and never rebuilt. The SS Llandovery Castle launched on September 3, 1913 from Glasgow, Scotland, where she was built, and she was officially completed by January 1914. And she was an impressive vessel. She was 152 meters long and had 6,500 horsepower steam engines that were capable of propelling the ship at a speed of 15 knots or 28 kilometers per hour. Now, originally planned as an ocean liner, she could carry 429 passengers in 3 classes. She didn't get much of a chance to work as an ocean liner because by July 1914, the First World War broke out. And that's when she became a mail ship, and initially she sailed between London and East Africa. Then from August 1914, she sailed on routes between London and West Africa. She was eventually commissioned to become a hospital ship and was assigned to the Canadian Forces. She was retrofitted with 622 hospital beds and could carry 102 medical staff, which would work in the interior surgical facilities, doctor offices, and more. Nate Hendley, author of Atrocity on the Atlantic, Attack on a Hospital Ship During the Great War, says it was an extensive process.
And at first they used the Llandovery Castle as a troop ship, and then they converted it to a hospital ship. This involves, massive renovation of the interior, putting in rooms for surgery, x-rays. A hospital ship isn't just a transport. It's got all the same facilities you'd see in a land-based hospital. So this was a fairly major transformation.
Her life as a hospital ship would be short-lived because in the waters of the North Atlantic, U-boats lurked. The First World War changed how wars were fought forever. There was the advent of tanks and airplanes, and along with them, early submarines entered the theater of war. Now, prior to the First World War, submarines existed but were largely ineffective in battle. During the American Civil War, the Confederate Navy's H.L. Hunley became the first submarine to sink an enemy vessel when she sunk the USS Housatonic, using a gunpowder-filled keg on a spar as a torpedo. Unfortunately, the shockwave from the explosion killed most of the submarine's crew and destroyed both vessels. 2 years later, in 1866, Submarine Explorer became the first submarine to dive, cruise underwater, and resurface under the control of her crew. Slowly, progress was made, and by the First World War, these war vessels were ready for their time in the spotlight. At the outbreak of the war, Germany had 20 submarines, while the British Royal Navy had 74. The British may have had more, but the Germans were far superior. Known as U-boats, which came from the anglicized German word U-boot for Unterseeboot or undersea boats, they soon began attacking Royal Navy warships in the North Sea. On November 7, 1916, Germany launched U-86 into the North Sea, and 6 months later she sank her first British ship, the Queensborough. It would be the first of many in her career of terror as she inflicted pain on the Allies. From March 1917 to June 1918, she was responsible for the carnage of sinking 31 ships and killing hundreds. In January 1918, Helmut Patzig took over her command. Now, he had risen through the ranks quite quickly after he joined the German Navy in 1910 as a fresh-faced 19-year-old cadet. In 1917, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his service as a submarine watch officer. By 1918, he was in command of U-86, and the submarine was assigned to patrol the area west of Ireland in the North Atlantic. At the time, Germany had declared unrestricted submarine warfare against Great Britain. This meant that instead of giving enemy crews notice, U-boat captains were told to sink them on sight. The command was brutal, but there were still rules to war, and that included how submarines dealt with hospital ships. The water around Great Britain and Ireland was an active war zone, but on February 4, 1915, German Navy commanders were notified to spare hospital ships. They were only to attack them if it was obvious they were transported troops. Nate Hendley says that the hospital ship designation was taken extremely seriously among the Allied nations to ensure the safety of their humanitarian efforts.
They're not allowed to carry guns, they're not allowed to carry munitions, war supplies, or even armed soldiers. During my research on the Llandovery Castle, I came across a series of memos where a surgeon had stopped an officer from trying to smuggle some souvenir swords on the ship. And this caused a huge uproar. There's all these memos up and down the chain of command. Oh, he's got these swords and that violates the Hague Convention. So they took that pretty seriously.
To ensure that hospital ships would not be a threat, vessels were designed to be very visible. They were painted white with a green band from stem to stern and a large red cross in the midship. At night, a row of red and green lights circled the ship. Nate Hendley says that this was done to ensure they could not be confused for a warship.
You can stop them, you can board them, but you can't sink them, you can't attack them.
But that would soon change.
And at first, a U-boat would actually approach a British or a French ship and give them fair warning, saying, okay, you guys cast off, we're going to sink you. They give time for guys to get off the ship. By 1918, they had pretty much thrown that out the window.
Hospital ships were now very much in danger, and from March 20th, 1917 to February 26th, 1918, 7 British hospital ships were sunk by German U-boats. But those attacks would pale in comparison to what would happen on the night of June 27th, 1918. When Rena McLean finished delivering wounded soldiers to Halifax 10 days earlier, she had no idea she would be boarding the Llandovery Castle for the last time. But she had always wanted to be a nurse. She was born in Prince Edward Island on June 14, 1879, and had completed her training as a nurse by 1908. At the outbreak of the First World War, she signed up to serve in the Canadian Army Medical Corps, and by November 1914, she was in France, helping the first of many Canadians that would be wounded in the trenches. Over the next 3 years, she served in France, the United Kingdom, and Greece, which was especially difficult and left her with PTSD. Now, to help her recover, she was placed on the Llandovery Castle so she could be far from the horrors of the front lines. She'd been given many chances to return home to Canada, but she refused each time. She wanted to go back to France where she could help the most people. And joining her on the ship was Pearl Fraser, another Canadian nurse who gave up a life of luxury to serve others. She was born in New Glasgow on March 20th, 1885 to Duncan Cameron Fraser, the future Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, and Bessie Grant. On September 28, 1914, shortly after she completed her nurse training, she enlisted with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. For the next 4 years, she served on hospital ships and helped wounded Canadians on their return home. Neither Rena or Pearl knew they would soon be casualties in a maritime war crime. By late June 1918, HHMS Llandovery Castle was on her 5th voyage across the Atlantic Ocean from Halifax. She had delivered 3,223 wounded men to Canada, and as she returned to Europe, there were no patients on board, only 164 crew members, 80 officers, enlisted men, and 14 nurses. John Eaton was serving with the Canadian Army Medical Corps. He had spent 28 months at the front lines before poisonous gas sent him home, and now he was on his way back to Europe. Just prior to boarding, he sent a letter to his parents in Vancouver. By the time it reached them, the Llandovery Castle would be underwater. And that's because on the evening of June 27, 1918, just as HHMS Llandovery Castle was nearing the Irish coast to pick up more wounded for transport, a U-boat appeared. Despite being clearly marked as a hospital ship with all her lights on, Captain Helmut Patzig believed that she was carrying troops and supplies. He didn't stop the ship, he didn't inspect the ship. Instead, he fired a torpedo directly at it. Rena McLean, Pearl Fraser, and John Eaton were all either sleeping or getting ready for bed. And within seconds, their blissful evening was shattered and their lives turned into a nightmare as the Llandovery Castle shook from the great explosion. Newspapers across Canada reported days later, quote, "No one on board saw the wake of the torpedo. The first intimation of the presence of a submarine was a jar and a roar of an explosion from aft. Then the lights went out." End quote. In the wireless cabin, the Marconi radio operator attempted to send out the ship's position to any friendly forces in the vicinity, but with no power, no message could get out. On the bridge, Captain Edward Sylvester sent a message to the engine room, but received no reply. Most of the crew were dead. With the ship doomed, people ran for the lifeboats, but getting them in the water was easier said than done. 2 smashed against the ship as it rocked lifeless in the ocean, while others became overwhelmed by the Atlantic's crushing waves. Survivors reported that there was an eerily quiet, no panic or cries for help could be heard as the ship sank. When Captain Sylvester was notified that the survivors were in lifeboats, he finally left the bridge with 10 of his crew. Sergeant Arthur King, who was in lifeboat number 5 with the nurses, said later, "Our boat was quickly loaded and lowered to the surface of the water. Then the crew of 8 men and myself faced the difficulty of getting free from the ropes holding us to the ship's side. I broke 2 axes trying to cut ourselves away, but was not successful." Lifeboat number 5 struggled as it smashed into the side of the ship, and the survivors used the oars to push themselves away from the hull. They made it to the water level, but drifted back towards the ship when the poop deck suddenly broke away and sank and sucked them in. They flipped into the water. The survivors had only lasted in the lifeboat for 8 minutes. Sergeant King said, "In that whole time, I did not hear a complaint or murmur from one of the sisters. There was not a cry for help or any outward evidence of fear." From the water, Pearl Fraser asked if there was any hope for them, and Sergeant King didn't sugarcoat it when he replied with a simple no. As the ship sank, it created a whirlpool sucking everybody in. Sergeant King was pulled down 3 times, but luckily grabbed a piece of the wreckage and was pulled to safety by the captain's boat. Others, not as lucky. King said, "The last I saw of the nursing sisters was as they were thrown over the side of the boat. All were wearing life belts, and of the 14, 2 were in their nightdress, the others in uniform." None of the nurses, including Pearl Fraser and Rena McLean, survived. At their memorial service in Toronto in July 1918, Reverend J. W. McMillan said, "It is commonly stated that this war is going to give women her true position in the world. Be careful that you aren't just given a banner and kept within the gates as before. See that this war wins a world victory for women. Nate Hendley says that the First World War was a major turning point for women.
Army nurses at this period had kind of a sacrosanct image that they were seen as nobly sacrificing themselves, putting themselves in the line of duty. So definitely they were seen as just sort of like, in almost religious terms, like the Holy Mother type of imagery. Some of the imagery from the war really plays into this, of this sort of saintly nurses helping the boys.
Meanwhile, on the Atlantic Ocean, Captain Sylvester and his crew began a rescue effort and managed to pull about a dozen men out of the water. But just as they did, the German U-boat responsible for the disaster resurfaced and suddenly appeared next to the lifeboat and asked the survivors to come closer. The tragedy appeared to be far from over. As the lifeboat and submarine floated side by side, a survivor let the U-boat know that they were picking up survivors. In response, the German fired his revolver in the air. The 24 survivors in the lifeboat were warned that if they did not get closer, they would be fired upon by the sub's big guns. Cannons were meant for battleships. It would have turned the lifeboat into cinders. Captain Sylvester had no choice but to surrender. He stepped onto the submarine deck and he was asked to identify his vessel. And when he did, he was accused of transporting 8 American flight officers. Sylvester immediately denied the accusation and stated, "I beg your pardon, we are not. We have 7 Canadian medical officers on board, and the ship is chartered by the Canadian government to carry sick and wounded men from England to Halifax." The German officer again accused him of carrying Americans to Europe, which Sylvester continued to deny. 10 minutes later, the captain was back in the lifeboat as Major Thomas Lyon, a medical officer, went onto the sub. When a German sailor grabbed him, Lyon fell and broke his ankle. Then he was accused of being an American flight officer, which he naturally denied. He said, quote, "I dread to think what would have happened to an American flying officer had he been in my shoes." End quote. Author Nate Hendley says that it seems as if Captain Patzig was looking for an excuse that could justify his actions.
They're convinced that the Allies, for whatever unusual reason, are smuggling American pilots on board hospital ships, which makes no sense at all because America already is at war with Germany and they have their own troop ships. So why would they need to go through all this, effort to, bring their guys to Europe?
Lyon was released after his interrogation and made his way back to the lifeboat just as a German officer whispered in his ear that he needed to get the lifeboat clear of the sub. Lyon relayed the message to Captain Sylvester, who said he had received the same warning. And while it may appear as a threat, the German officer was likely trying to save their lives, because Captain Helmut Patzig had devious plans for the survivors of the Llandovery Castle. As the survivors scrambled to distance themselves from the sub, Captain Patzig, Lieutenant Ludwig Dithmar, and Lieutenant John Bolt, and another man named Meisner watched from the deck of U-86. Then they fired, not from a revolver, but from the sub's cannon, which, with each shot, explosions rippled across the ocean. Where survivors once huddled in lifeboats, only wood and flesh remained. The only lifeboat to escape the carnage was the one containing Captain Sylvester and Major Lyon. It was clear that Captain Patzig was trying to eliminate witnesses to his war crimes, but they managed to escape the onslaught and drifted for the next 36 hours until HMS Lysander saw them. But their long ordeal was over, and soon the world would learn what had happened that night. Of the 234 crew members of the Llandovery Castle, only 24 survived, and they were all on Captain Sylvester's lifeboat. For days afterwards, other ships looked for survivors, but only found carnage on the water. Kenneth Cummins, a midshipman on his first voyage out, was on HMS Moria, and he wrote, "It was quite horrific, and my reaction was to vomit over the edge. It was something we could never have imagined, particularly the nurses. Seeing these bodies of women and nurses floating in the ocean, having been there for some time, huge aprons and skirts and billows, which looked almost like sails because they dried in the hot sun." Meanwhile, U-86 would go on to attack and sink an American troop ship, but the sub wouldn't live to see the end of the war because on its way home, it hit a sea mine. Author Nate Hendley says that some believed it was no accident.
Some of the more superstitious crew members think this is a sign of God's wrath for, sinking a hospital ship.
As news of the attack of the Llandovery Castle reached Canada, it was met with outrage. Brigadier George Tuxford, who commanded the 3rd Infantry Brigade of the 1st Canadian Division, said the ambush was a rallying cry. He stated, quote, "I gave instructions to the brigade that the battle cry on the 8th of August should be Llandovery Castle, and that the cry should be the last to ring in the ears of the Hun as the bayonet was driven home." End quote. One of the most famous Canadian posters from the First World War featured a soldier holding a nursing sister in the Atlantic Ocean amid the wreckage of the Llandovery Castle. While he holds the woman with one hand, he is shaking his fist at the German U-boat. In bold letters, it said, "Remember the Llandovery Castle." Used for propaganda and to sell victory bonds, it was highly effective, and Nate Hendley says that the attack was used by many in the war effort.
Robert Borden, who was Prime Minister at the time, cites the Llandovery Castle several times in speeches and, describing the Germans as barbarians and urging, Canadians to sort of, fight on and remember the Llandovery Castle. The Americans did it too. I was a little surprised to discover that there were American posters about the Llandovery Castle with numerous inaccuracies. But nonetheless, that this was a shocking event around the world, not just Canada.
Allied nations were angry by the assault on a humanitarian vessel, and in Germany, blame was shifted to the British and the crew instead of the U-boat. Nate Hendley says they portrayed the incident as an accident.
They did send kind of a mealy-mouthed letter in response to the attack, in which they basically said, "We think the ship actually hit a sea mine. Don't blame us. It's not our fault." And basically, if it was, even if it was our fault, this sort of rather pathetic response, instead of owning up to it and saying, "Yes, we committed a terrible error," they sort of try to fob it off and create this conspiracy theory that the British are just making this up and the ship actually was sunk by a mine.
In 1921, Captain Helmut Patzig, along with Lieutenant Ludwig Dithmar and John Bolt, appeared at the Leipzig War Crimes Trial before the German Supreme Court. The trials were mandated under the Treaty of Versailles, and 9 war crimes were tried, including the one related to the Llandovery Castle. Nate Hendley says that the Allies struggled to present a case in front of the German court.
The Allies don't occupy Germany, so they have to rely on Berlin's cooperation to get anything done. Germany will handle both the prosecution and the defense, and all you have to do is give us lists of, suspects and provide witnesses and witness statements. And the Allies kind of grumble about this, but eventually they agree because they're playing with a very weak hand.
For their part, Lieutenants Ludwig Dithmar and John Bolt claimed innocence, and Bolt even testified that he was just obeying his commanding officer. He said, "His orders were law. I am not guilty." Nate Hendley says that was a common testimony.
The German witnesses, for the most part, are very belligerent. They all say, we listened to our commander, we obeyed orders, I don't feel any guilt. What's the problem? And in the courtroom, we've got a lot of spectators from Germany, and they're very vocally in favor of the defendants.
On July 16, 1921, the Imperial Court of Justice convicted Lieutenants Ludwig Dithmar and John Bolt to 4 years imprisonment for having assisted with the firing on the lifeboats. The court found that it was perfectly clear to the accused that their act was against the law and that they should have refused to obey. Nate Hendley says that despite the ruling, many did not feel justice was served.
Everyone thinks the Leipzig trials were a joke, a farce, and Canada at this point is kind of retreating from the sort of rah-rah, enthusiasm for the war. And there's a lot of speculation about the war. People are kind of questioning the purpose.
The court noted that the commander of the U-boat was primarily responsible for these attacks. However, his whereabouts were unknown. And that's because Captain Patzig had escaped to Danzig, an independent city in Poland outside of Germany jurisdiction. He survived through to the Second World War, where he took on various roles in the German Navy, including instruction and training. And from 1941 to 1943, Captain Patzig was a torpedo attack instructor for the 25th U-boat flotilla in the Baltic Sea. From 1943 to the end of the war, he was given command of the 26th U-boat flotilla, another group of submarines in training. For his service in the war, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and the War Merit Cross, and he died in West Germany on March 11, 1984. However, the war crime trial he escaped from had far-reaching consequences. After the lax trial following the First World War, the world took a much different approach after the atrocities of the Second World War. Most notably, the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo war crimes trials were established by the Allied powers to prosecute high-ranking political and military officials from the Axis powers for crimes committed during the war. These trials would go on to prosecute major figures from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, thereby establishing the legal principle of holding national leaders accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Its charters included the principle that obeying orders did not mean one was immune to war crime prosecution, because, as they had done during the Leipzig trials a quarter century earlier, many used the argument that they were just following orders. However, Soviet, British, and American prosecutors cited the Llandovery Castle, ruling in 3 different trials from 1943 to 1947, and in each case, they got a conviction. In 2002, the International Criminal Court was created to prosecute war criminals, and it followed the same principle inspired decades earlier by the Llandovery Castle case. The court to this day does not allow superior orders as a defense and is only considered in terms of sentencing. And that is how a Canadian tragedy has influenced how the world prosecutes war crimes to this very day. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the sinking of the Llandovery Castle. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories, and there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com, or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.